Fela was more than a musician. He was a controversial global icon, a zealot, a political activist, a trailblazer, and a rebel whose powerful message and Afrobeat musical style lives on today in contemporary music around the world. Fela's music was a weapon that he used to fight the corruption of the government and military brutality who upheld European beliefs and rejected African culture. His music empowered the voiceless masses of Nigeria's society and united them around a common cause of fighting an oppressive government during the 70s and 80s. Through his music, Fela was able to break the colonial mentality barrier that was apparent in all aspects of life in Nigeria and brought forth widespread appreciation of African culture globally. The Nigerian region was occupied and ruled by British authorities in the mid-14th century for over 400 years during the slave trade. All over the continent, other soon-to-be African nations experienced the same occupation of their land by Europeans. From the early 1900s to 1950s, this occupation evolved into the colonization system where the European powers asserted their dominance over the people in Africa.
Everything was European background. The upbringing, the teaching in school, everything had to be English and everything. We were not even allowed to speak our country's language in school.
The colonial powers were also abhorring African traditions and taught them in churches and schools that their traditions were crude and not good enough to be a part of the modern world. Fela would name this phenomenon colonial mentality. As a result of this, many Africans aspired to fit European ideals and resented anything African. When Nigeria gained its independence on October 1st, 1960, this colonial mentality was embedded in every aspect of life in Nigeria, and the government would use force to keep it this way. This would act as a catalyst for Fela to use his music to empower the masses and call out the government and elites in Africa. Fela Anikulapo Kuti was born on October 15, 1938, into an affluent family that was a part of the bourgeoisie class. His father was an Anglican minister and school principal, and his mother was a leading feminist in the women's rights movement. His two brothers attended college in Europe and studied medicine. He would later follow in their footsteps. Once he discovered his passion for music, he studied it. Europeans provided the bourgeoisie in Africa the opportunity to study in Europe so that the Africans could implement Western beliefs and institutions in Africa and repeat this cycle. It would not be until Fela's studies in England and the journey to the United States where he would break the cycle and become more aware of the political affairs in Nigeria. Many of the bourgeoisie in Nigeria never thought about what it meant to be African since they were trapped in their bubbles of wealth. Fela used his trip to England to explore what it actually meant. While studying at Trinity College in London in 1958, he experienced discrimination for the first time because he was African.
In England, I started to feel, oh wow, so these white people don't like us too much. This is my experience from having to rent rooms. I had so much. At that time, you read the newspapers in England, house for rent, no coloreds, no dogs, and all this. That annoyed me a lot, and not many students, so at my student days in England, I started to be aware of having to be an African, but we had nothing to offer as Africans because we were all just taught English.
As a result of this awakening of his lack of knowledge on African topics, he started to read books about Africa and listen to African music. At the same time, he started a band called Kula Lobitos, where he experimented with African rhythms and combined it with American and Caribbean jazz. His journey to England was just the beginning of Fela's political conscientiousness. Fela would ultimately break his mental colonial mentality barrier when he and his band would travel to the United States to perform. Fela and his band arrived in the United States in June of 1969. In 1969, many blacks in America were filled with a revolutionary spirit. The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. riled up the black community nationwide. One revolutionary that was an integral player on helping Fela gain political conscientiousness was Sandra Isidore. In the United States, African Americans were looking to Africa for answers to help them solve the problems that the black community was facing in America, and Sandra hoped to get some answers from Fela. But the opposite happened. She introduced Fela to revolutionary texts from many influential black radical thinkers, such as Martin Luther King Jr., Kwame Ture, Angela Davis, and Malcolm X. Through listening to Sandra and learning from these revolutionary texts, he drew parallels of the racism in America and the colonial racism in Nigeria. The main difference between the people in Nigeria and the people in America was that the blacks in America were working to change the oppression, while the blacks in Nigeria accepted the oppression they were facing. This was a turning point in Fela's career. He wanted to change the way that people felt about the oppression they were facing, especially in Africa. Instead of accepting the oppression, he wanted them to confront it. His first song after this revelation was My Lady's Frustration, in honor of Sandra. This song was the beginning of his unique Afrobeat music. He believed that this was the first song that he wrote when he was thinking African. He even renamed his band to Africa 70. Fela had finally broken the mental barrier that was ingrained in him by the colonists and the Nigerian government. Whenever he and his band returned to Nigeria in 1970, he was determined to use his music to empower the people all over Africa and encourage them to confront the colonial injustice that they were facing. Fela's musical style underwent another change upon his arrival in Nigeria. He decided to sing his songs in Pidgin English, a popular variation of English that is spoken all over Africa so that it could resonate with the masses. He chose Pidgin English because singing in his tribal language would negate his Pan-African message, and singing in English would negate his anti-colonization message. He produced many songs during this time period, with at least 3 songs a week. The main issues that Fela sang about were poverty, government corruption, and the colonial mentality. Fela believed that the institution that needed to be changed the most in Nigeria was the government because they upheld European values that only benefited the wealthy citizens. An example is in his song Colonial Mentality. Fela is addressing the general African population and telling them to release themselves from the colonization mentality that they are stuck in. The people who were most uplifted by his music were the poor.
It became extremely popular and became the spokesperson for the oppressed and the poor. He and Bob Marley shared something in common. And both of them, they actually did not pretend to be representing the poor, because whatever money he was making, he was spending it in the community. The Kalakuta Republic, even now that his son inherited it, you can walk in and sleep there. That endeared him to millions of people, because it's one thing to be talking about poverty elimination, to be talking about injustice. It's another to live it.
Fela's lifestyle, along with the political messages present in his music, enabled his audience to achieve political conscientiousness. Fela was able to break the mental barrier that handicapped Africans for decades. As his fan base grew, the government took action to suppress Fela and his supporters to uphold the colonial mentality. They would beat and torture them on the streets. This would fuel Fela's messages in his music and make them stronger. The cycle of torture and Fela releasing new music with stronger political messages would continue until he released his most politically oppositional song, Zombie. This song brutally criticized the Nigerian government and military. Fela calls the soldiers terroristic, mindless zombies who take orders from the government to cause violence across Nigeria. This song infuriated the government, and on February 18, 1977, they struck back. 1,000 soldiers attacked the Kalakuta Republic, which was his communal compound. Fela's mother was thrown out of a window and subsequently died. This day was very traumatic for Fela, but it only made the message in his music stronger. He continued to make music and integrate political messages into it until his death on August 2nd, 1997. Fela and his music evolved tremendously over his career. He went from a bourgeoisie musician who sang about love to a rebellious political activist who called out to the government. Though ultimately he did not achieve his goal during his life, he was able to make people in Africa more politically conscious, with them questioning the status quo and calling out the military dictatorships. With his music, Fela was able to break the colonial mentality barrier that handicapped people from embracing Africanness, and today it is embraced around the world. He also had a major impact on music, and many musicians today are continuing his message in their music.